I think it goes without saying at this point that every color in Lorcana has a meta-defining trait associated with it, as well as some other sub-traits, but when you think of Ruby, you probably think of banishing cards, and when you think of Sapphire, you likely think of ramping up on ink or getting ahead on the ink curve versus your opponent. These are two very powerful individual effects that when combined can be absolutely devastating. The only problem was you couldn't really combine these in set 1 because this color combination would run out of gas very quickly, and you'd be in top deck mode at the mercy of your opponent who had more cards in hand from, let's say, Amber Steel Rockstar Stitch combos or Ruby Amethyst card draw engine with the Amethyst cards. Well, that changes a little bit with the introduction of Rise of the Floodborn, and what you're seeing on screen here is the deck list that utilizes the Harem PAWPSICLE engine with Nick Wilde in order to banish items and draw cards, and utilize the high-end threats on the Ruby and Sapphire side in Hades, Maleficence, and even the Tamatoa, and Lady Tremaine to a certain extent, to have you try to close out the late game, and the Gaston because it quests for 3, even though it's not really a big body, air quotes. So let's go ahead and break down this deck and then look at some matches. So we're going to break down this deck into 2 parts. The first part, we're going to look at the low end of the curve where you will struggle a lot. And then the second part is going to look at the high end of the curve where you will likely just dominate if you get there. So on the low end of the curve, we have 9 1-drops, 3 Minnie Mouse, and 4 PAWPSICLE, which is the heart and soul of the deck, 1 shield and 1 scepter. The scepter is totally up to you. I was just testing it out. You probably don't want to play it, but it's a total of 9 1-drops, and ideally you want PAWPSICLE at least 1 in rotation so that you can get the engine going. On the 2-drop slot, I've only opted for 4 Grandma and 4 Teeth and Ambitions. So likely you won't be playing Teeth right away unless you have the mini or can play Grandma, then play Teeth the next turn or Sing it the next turn if you want. But this package allows you to basically go 2 for 1 off of Teeth, where you can get your ink ramp off the Grandma and also deal with a threat on the opponent's board. It's really nice when you Teeth and Ambitions away a Pinocchio, the new 2-drop 1/1 that quests for 3. That is very nice to slow down the opponent. And then on the 3-drop, we have opted to play the Mickey Mouse instead of the 1 Jump Aheads and 2 Judy Hops. Most lists are running 3, I think, but I just haven't run into situations where it's as useful. It's mostly just ink. And for that reason, you might actually want to run 3 Judy and 3 Mickey, because this deck is higher than the normal amount of uninkables that I would like to play in 17, as you see on the screen there, instead of the 14. So keep that in mind. If you're bricking a little bit, you might want to maybe just lower that ratio a little bit of the Mickeys. But Judy, I just found, is mostly ink most of the time. Then on turn 4, this is where you start to hopefully develop your engine. And there are times where it won't work and you'll likely just lose because you didn't see an item or you didn't see the harem. And so that's the one fault of this deck. It's not invincible by any means, but if you do see this engine, it is very, very strong because, like I said in the beginning, you will start initiating your card draw. If you drop the harem, you banish an item, you draw 2, you've replenished your hand. Hopefully you're not playing into a whole new world, but if you don't, you will have resources to continue playing with the deck. And so that's basically the low end of the curve. Obviously the Nick, when you play it, recycles the PAWPSICLE, so it's just kind of a recursion engine, so you can keep banishing the PAWPSICLE with the harem in order to draw more cards. But let's go ahead and start talking about the higher end of the curve, which I consider to be 5 and above. So similar to Ruby Amethyst, which is a deck that I actually played in real life and I have a lot of experience with, once you get to the higher end of the curve with this deck, if your opponent hasn't run away with the game, you'll likely start to lock things down. Again, this deck might end up being less robust than Ruby Amethyst was in set 1, just because there's a lot more variability out there. But essentially, you have to try to stabilize the board with Maui and maybe the Lady Tremaine, and or start digging for cards with the Gaston on your 6-drop. And then you play 2 Robin Hood, which is a decent addition because A, it's inkable, whereas Gaston is not. And it can challenge evasive characters, so it can help deal with evasive threats, but it can also draw you a card if you're not seeing your engine. So you might actually want to go 3 Robin Hood and 2 Gaston. You can play with those ratios a little bit if you want. Again, if you find yourself bricking a little too much, that might be one of the other solutions. But you essentially want to stabilize on turns 5 and 6 with those cards and start setting up your play. And this is where a whole new world can really hurt you, because if you've tried to set up your hand a certain way to start really controlling the board at this point, if you get whole new worlded, well, all that goes out the window. But ideally, you want to have a Be Prepared ready in hand. This whole deck basically functions around Be Prepared, because you're ramping up your ink in the first couple of turns, you're maintaining your hand with the card draw engine and hoping that your opponent just doesn't aggro you to death. But if you survive the onslaught in the beginning, 4, 5, 6 turns. Now you drop the Be Prepared, you reset the board state, and then from there on in, it's just like Ruby Amethyst, where at the end of the curve, you should be locking the opponent out because you should have things like Hades dropping, more Maleficent, more Be Prepareds, Tamatoa. You have your big threats coming down, and even things like Gaston, Lady Tremaine, and the Robin Hood are big threats in and of themselves. Again, you have more cards to help stabilize, like the 4 Let It Goes. You can't afford to run Dragonfire because it's also uninkable, but you could make a case if you wanted to run Dragonfire over the Lady Tremaine, but they're both uninkable, and Lady Tremaine is at least a body. But you don't get to choose with Lady Tremaine, which can be a plus or a negative, because after you drop the Be Prepared, if your opponent only plays 1 card, then the Lady Tremaine directly deals with it. But then again, so with Dragonfire, but Lady Tremaine is a body. So there's still a lot of internal debate around which one you want to play. Everybody clearly sees Lady Tremaine is better right now, but once people start learning how to play around the Lady Tremaine, it will definitely drop in its value that you get out of it, and Dragonfire might be the more optimal choice, because even the Emerald Steel decks right now aren't really playing that many warded characters, and if they do, like Prince John isn't hitting the board with by itself, right? It's hitting the board with something else. You're not really seeing Kuzco's in the meta anymore, so there's a lot to see in terms of evolution and what's going to happen, but that's the deck list. Let's go ahead and jump into some matches and you can see how it works. Alright, before we go any further, I would appreciate a like on this video if you've made it this far, because it did take me a long time to edit this video as I cut out a lot of my opponent's waiting time, since this video, as you can probably see, is very long. But I did this because I think there is a lot to explain in this deck, since it is kind of a control-oriented deck. In this matchup though, it's going to show you kind of how this deck plays out properly on curve if you get everything going. And so we played a Popsicle turn 1, and we have a 2-drop, so it's all good. You can see here the timer pops up for my opponent. They're taking like forever on turns 1 and 2. I don't understand why this is a constant problem on Pixelborn, but it is what it is. Anyways, yeah, just skipping ahead here, you can see that we end up inking a Maui, and I'm going to opt to drop a Fishbone Quill on turn 3. So we've played out on curve perfectly, and now you're going to see the small combo of using Teeth and Ambitions with the Grandma. I'm able to take out the opponent's Snow White and my own Grandma and get my Grandma as ink, so I gain a little bit of extra advantage on the curve there. They're opting to play a Simba, so this is some kind of like hybrid Steel Song with Snow White, I guess. But you see on turn 4, you know, everything's just working out perfectly for us. We drop the Hiram, we draw 2 by banishing the Popsicle, and your hands are not going to be like this all the time. You have 2 Nicks to recycle too, so it's almost like our hand was like fixed, because it's like literally the perfect hand. But you can see just how strong it is. But even though we get all of this off, the opponent still has 5 cards in hand. We do have the Ingent rolling, and this is what we have to kind of bank on, because now you can see the advantage starting to build up if they can't deal with the Hiram. But like I said, as people adapt to this deck, they will likely see that and definitely try to remove it. So my opponent does the turn 4 Stitch Shift, which is pretty strong, and then they're going to Quest Force 4, going up to 7. And yeah, again, they're taking forever, so I'm just like, hello, are you still there? Did you like what's going on here? Being on Amber Steel though, you don't want your hand to be too big, because again, you have to worry about the whole new world. So I make a very odd play here, but my attempts, my thinking here is I'm trying to do enough to clear the opponent's board, so when they do whole new world, they're basically forced to hard cast it. So I don't want them singing it with anything, so whatever they try to put on board, I want to remove it so that they're forced to hard cast the whole new world, and then they have nothing left to play on their turn because they've used up all their ink, and then they have to pass back to me, and therefore I'm the first person to play off of the whole new world. So unfortunately they had an aerial, but they don't hit off of it, which or they choose not to grab something because maybe they already have the whole new world in hand and they revealed one. But then at this point I'm like going wider on my board, because I'm not really that afraid of a Grab Your Swords. Like, it does clear my board to a certain extent, but it's fine because I actually want to drop this second Hiram on board potentially to play around a Grab Your Sword. But I would end with a Nick and a FLAVERSHAM. Sorry. If they do Grab Your Swords, and sure enough they do. So they opt to play Let the Storm Rage On. My guess is to draw a card as well as take out my Nick. But I'm like, for sure they have to have a whole new world, right? So they just wipe my whole board up. But at this point, you can see how far ahead I am on ink. and with the Tamatoa, we're able to grab back the PAWPSICLE. We're going to use Fishbone to start dumping our hand faster because, again, I am anticipating that the opponent is on the Whole New World. I probably should not have used the Harem here because I'm just drawing cards that are going to get discarded to a Whole New World. And I had nothing to take out the Aerial there, I don't think, unless I wanted to be prepared. So despite me talking big about not wanting to play into a Whole New World and forcing them to hardcast it, they did end up singing it in the end. But at this point, there's nothing really Amber Steel can do once you've hit this far along the line, because they have no real way to deal with your bomb threats. And this is where Ruby Amethyst would really suffer against Amber Steel, in that your deck was just a little too slow. It was good because you drew a lot of cards, but when you got wheeled away, you would just lose all of your advantage. And your opponent would have a superior board state because you couldn't build up fast enough to your Be Prepared to wipe it. And if you didn't properly maintain tempo or didn't draw into a Be Prepared, or you just can't deal with the board the opponent put up fast enough, you just lose before you even get to Be Prepared. Whereas with this deck, you can see, well, I mean, I did go first and that helps a lot. The Amber Steel versus Ruby Amethyst matchup from set 1 really did depend on who went first a lot of the time, but I was able to ramp up quicker and I was still able to maintain somewhat of a card draw. So despite getting Whole New Worlded, you could see how far ahead I was in the ink, and because of that, my Tamatoa is basically like invincible against this deck because they have nothing to deal with this 8 body. Yeah, they're just flooding the board, and I'm guessing they have another Whole New World, but I'm like, yeah, you just can't deal with my threats here. So I'm actually just going to mop up things a little bit, and I could use Fishbone Quill, ink the Be Prepared, which is what I think I'm doing. And I could have dropped the Lady Tremaine and forced out another card from their board, but then I'm like thinking, well, all of these things are just questing for 1, so they're not really that threatening. My Tamatoa is questing for 5, or 6, or whatever it was questing for there. So yeah, I'm just going to get back more items and just build up my board even more massively. And, you know, to be fair, this is not a meta Amber Steel deck, it's 7 Dwarves, but you can see the power of this deck in the end game, and that's going to go ahead and wrap up this match, and we're going to move on to the second one in just a moment. Alright, so looking at this next match here, you're going to see what happens when the deck doesn't go according to plan, and similar to what Ruby Amethyst experienced when you ended up mulliganing and then drawing into like Dragonfires or Ursulas and Elsas, things that wouldn't be playable in your hand until you got to the 5, 6, 7, 8 ink. It feels really bad, and there you can see we drew a Be Prepared, and this deck will suffer those same consequences, whereas Ruby Amethyst still had a chance to draw out of it because of things like the Maleficent 3 drop and the Friends on the other side. With this deck, you're kind of bricked up harder. The saving grace is that you might be able to generate some additional ink with cards like the Mickey and the Grandma, as you see on my field here, in order to replace the fact that you can't really draw your way out of this aside from drawing for each turn until you get to turn 4 and turn your Harem engine online, which leads me to my second detriment of this deck, where you have to assume that you can get your Harem engine online, and if you don't, then you're kind of bricked up even harder and longer, and your opponent can definitely take advantage of that, especially if you go up against those aggro decks. So I didn't want to ink that Teeth and Ambitions, but at this point I have to because I want to keep my Harem in case I draw an item. The issue also was I inked my only item in hand in the Fishbone Quill, and while playing Fishbone Quill and getting these uninkables out of my hand isn't the purpose of it, having it on field as an item that Harem could have banished, in hindsight, likely was the better play, because when you're playing with this deck, a deck with more than like 15 uninkables, even that extra 1 or 2 can be the difference and be the game breaker for you. Like if I was playing 15 uninkables, maybe I didn't have 2 uninkabled be prepared in my hand. But my opponent thankfully makes a misplay here, and they opt to take out my Grandma, which gives me my 7th ink, and otherwise I would have been forced to use the Harem as ink and then Be Prepared. But because my opponent took out my Grandma, I'm able to play the Be Prepared without needing to ink the Harem and pass turn, which again makes me miss an ink drop, and I have no board presence. So despite all that, cards are still even 5 on 5, but I have just reset the board state, and I know I have endgame threats. I don't know what my opponent has. This Pinocchio is actually a pretty decent card. Whether that was an Ursula or a Pinocchio, they're both questing for 3, and they would both get taken out by the Lady Tremaine in the end. The difference is, obviously, the Pinocchio doesn't do anything except for quest, whereas the Ursula draws a card and makes me lose a lore, and it quests for 3 as well. So you know, you can pick your poison there, but the Pinocchio is definitely a big threat, just like the Ursula would be. But Ursula is obviously, you know, a 7 costing card for a reason, and that is the reason. My opponent drops the Hades though, and then Yzma's away their Hades in order to draw 2, so they've just cycled back a huge threat into their deck and got card advantage off of it, but they lose board presence, and because of that, we end up Maleficent Dragoning their Yzma. Also, they forgot to quest with their Hades first and then put it back, but doesn't really make a difference in the end. A lot of people forget to do that on this game apparently. The opponent opts to let it go my Maleficent, which again is negative card advantage for them because my Maleficent just went 2 for 1 right there. They drop an Alice and I'm not threatened by this at all, so at this point I'm like, this game should be in the bag despite me not having the Harem engine online. But I definitely should have lost this match because, you know, my opponent misplayed a little bit there and that allowed me to kind of stay in it. Whereas if you were facing up against maybe, again, I'm not trying to talk trash to this opponent. Everybody makes different decisions and choices. And maybe they were just testing out something like they wanted to test this Grandpappy. But I'm just saying in a higher level situation, what likely would have happened is the opponent would have been able to maintain board control a little bit better. And with Amethyst, you're still drawing cards. And so they would be trying to keep me off of my threats and maintain tempo instead of going for this Alice and healing stuff, right? Where it's not necessarily a gimmick, but unless you already have control of the board, you're not going to be able to get your combos off because I'll just disrupt it every single time. And so, like you saw, they dropped the Grandpappy and I Maleficent Dragoned it away. So you got one time 2 lore off of it. You couldn't protect it. It quests for 3 as well, which is huge. So, you know, it's just a one-time thing. You drop it and you got 2 lore off it, which in the end is no value. So I pass my turn. I'm on Mickey and Maleficent. I've got a number of cards in hand, just drawing for turn, holding back on my threats here. No need to be prepared right now, but the opponent does have 4 questing power on board, and now they've just opted to take out one of my cards, my Mickey. And at this point, I'm like, yeah, maybe I could just drop a Be Prepared. So I'm going to quest with the Maleficent, ready it up, and then sing a Be Prepared. Just because, again, going, I guess, in this point, well, it is technically still 3 for 1 because the Maleficent would have 2 for 1 at the beginning, is pretty good. I end up dropping the FLAVERSHAM there, FLAVERSHAM, sorry, and I don't even think I had an item to banish at that point. I dropped the Gaston, get a Fishbone Quill, and then play it so that I could quest with the FLAVERSHAM, and banish it to draw 2. And at this point now, the game is over. But again, my opponent kind of ran out of gas. They didn't really play that optimally. And, you know, at this point, we're just able to take full advantage, draw into another item off the Gaston, and this is why you play the Gaston. But again, it is an uninkable. You see how the Lady Tremaines, they're uninkables. This is all problems potentially for the deck that you would run into. And against a more competitive deck, you would have definitely lost this match. So again, suffering the same consequences as Ruby Amethyst to a certain extent, maybe a little bit more exacerbated by the fact that if you have a high uninkable count, you are running into these problems more often and it's harder to claw your way out of it because you don't have the draw power. But nonetheless, it is still a very powerful deck and one that I wanted to showcase for you guys. If you made it this far in the video, thank you again for watching. I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up there. Quantum is out.